getting to the rim, and maybe for you individually as well?
Just attacking in space, not relenting to just shooting from the outside, and just trying to get paint touches.
The prescription bottle slipped from Mrs. Patricia Williams' trembling hands as she stood in line at the CVS pharmacy on Hickman Road in Des Moines, watching the digital display blink out an impossible number, $847.32, the price of the insulin that would keep her alive for another month. Her thin fingers, once so steady when holding chalk or turning the pages of Charlotte's Web, shook as though the weight of that number had drained the last of her strength. What the 68-year-old retired primary school teacher didn't know was that just 3 people behind her in that same line stood one of her former pupils. A woman the whole world now knew as Caitlin Clark, the WNBA phenomenon, a millionaire athlete whose name was chanted in arenas across America. Caitlin had come home for the holidays, stopping by this familiar pharmacy on her way back from her parents' house. Lost in her phone and the gentle hum of Christmas songs playing faintly over the speakers. She wasn't paying attention until she heard a voice. Soft, kind, and tired. That cut through the noise and dragged her instantly back to 3rd grade at Dowling Elementary. That voice had once guided her through storybooks, teaching her how to sound out tricky words, how to be brave enough to stand in front of a class and read aloud. It was the voice that first told her she was bright, capable, and destined for something extraordinary. Mrs. Williams had been her teacher, her compass, and her quiet believer. The woman who taught her that learning was not a chore but a door to everything she could ever imagine. Yet now, that same woman stood frail, her once proud posture bent under invisible burdens, her clothes neat but worn, her silver hair loosely pinned, and her eyes clouded with quiet defeat. "Ma'am, will you be paying cash or card today?" the young pharmacy technician asked, her tone polite but edged with the weary detachment of someone who had seen this scene, replayed too many times before. Mrs. Williams hesitated, her lips parting, her voice caught between pride and despair. She began, then stopped, her throat tight. Caitlin could see the humiliation in the older woman's eyes, the kind that comes not from poverty itself, but from the shock of having fallen into it after a lifetime of giving. This was the woman who had spent 4 decades shaping young minds, buying crayons and notebooks out of her own modest salary, staying after school to help struggling students, believing in a system that had promised security in return for service. Now, with her $1,200 monthly pension swallowed by rent and basic bills, she was being forced to choose between groceries and medicine, between light and life. "Is there a cheaper version?" Mrs. Williams asked, her tone polite, steady, though Caitlin could hear the exhaustion in it, the kind of tired that seeps into the soul. "This is already the generic," the pharmacist said softly, lowering her voice. "You're getting the maximum discount."
"I'm sorry."
The woman nodded slowly, her eyes closing for a moment, lips moving in a silent prayer. "Put it back, please," she whispered. "I'll figure something else out." That was the moment Caitlin Clark stepped forward, her heart pounding as recognition and disbelief collided inside her. "Excuse me," she said, removing her baseball cap, her voice calm but firm. "I'd like to pay for this lady's prescription." Every head turned, but Caitlin's eyes were fixed on the woman in front of her. Mrs. Williams turned, blinking, and then gasped. "Caitlin Clark," she whispered, her voice trembling with astonishment and emotion. "My little Caitlin, is that really you?" Caitlin nodded, smiling through the sting of tears. "Yes, ma'am, it's me, and I'm going to take care of this." The pharmacist's eyes widened in recognition, but Caitlin didn't care about the stares. This wasn't a headline moment. It was personal, intimate, a full-circle encounter between 2 people bound by gratitude and grace. They sat later in Caitlin's car in the dim light of the parking lot, the heater humming softly, the smell of peppermint coffee lingering between them. Mrs. Williams clutched the insulin in her lap as if it were gold, her frail hands trembling from cold and emotion. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked under the weight of years she had spent pretending she was fine. "I taught for 42 years, she said quietly, staring out the window. 42 years of showing up early, staying late, buying supplies for children who couldn't afford them. I never married, never had children. My students were my family. I thought that when I retired, I'd be able to live comfortably, read books, maybe travel. But the pension barely covers the bills, and the cost of my medication keeps going up. I've started skipping doses just to make it stretch. Caitlin felt her throat tighten, the same helpless anger she felt after a tough loss rising again. But this was no game. This was the woman who had built her foundation, now battling a system that treated her devotion as disposable. "I'm so sorry," Caitlin said softly, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "You gave everything. This shouldn't be happening to you." Mrs. Williams smiled faintly, her eyes glistening behind her glasses. "You were always the one who felt things deeply, Caitlin. I used to tell your mother you'd do great things, not because you were the best at everything, but because you cared. You cared enough to try." The words hit Caitlin harder than she expected. She realized that much of her success, her discipline, her empathy, her drive, had its roots in the kindness of this woman who had once stayed after school to help her with reading assignments. It was Mrs. Williams who had written on her third-grade report card, "Caitlin has a fire in her. One day it will light up the world." That night, Caitlin couldn't sleep. The image of Mrs. Williams, dignified yet broken, haunted her. The next morning, she made calls. She spoke with local officials, charity foundations, and eventually, through her own platform, announced the creation of the Williams Education and Wellness Fund, dedicated to helping retired teachers cover medical expenses and essential living costs. The story of that CVS encounter spread like wildfire, moving millions to tears. The next day, reporters called it the moment that redefined gratitude. But for Caitlin, it wasn't charity. It was justice. "If we can build arenas in honor of athletes," she said during a later press conference, "then we can make sure the people who built us don't have to choose between food and medicine." When she visited Mrs. Williams a week later, the older woman looked stronger, her cheeks flushed with new energy and hope. "You didn't have to do all this," she said, shaking her head. Caitlin smiled, the same smile she once gave after a winning game. "You once told me that greatness isn't about trophies, it's about what you give back. I'm just doing what you taught me." Mrs. Williams laughed softly, tears glistening in her eyes. "Then I suppose I did my job." News outlets across the country began sharing similar stories of teachers struggling under impossible financial burdens, sparking a national conversation about how societies value education. Donations poured in from around the world, and within weeks, hundreds of retired educators received assistance. But beyond the headlines and hashtags, the most profound transformation was personal, a moment of grace between a teacher and her student, where love, gratitude, and justice met in one act of human decency. And though Mrs. Williams continued to live modestly, her life changed in quiet, meaningful ways. She no longer feared the pharmacy counter. She began tutoring children again, volunteering at the library, her confidence slowly restored. When asked by a local reporter how she felt about Caitlin's gesture, she smiled and said, "I'm proud, not just because she remembered me, but because she understood what being human really means. Seeing someone else's pain and refusing to look away." Caitlin would later say in an interview, "That day reminded me that heroes don't always wear jerseys. Sometimes they wear cardigans and carry books." The moment at that CVS, once a symbol of despair, became a story of redemption. Not just for one teacher, but for a whole generation of forgotten educators who had once lit the spark in millions of young minds. For Mrs. Patricia Williams, it was proof that the lessons she taught had taken root. For Caitlin Clark, it was a reminder that greatness is not measured by what you earn, but by what you return. And for everyone who heard their story, it
Get more paint touches, and we also want to shoot the three a little bit better, so being more aggressive.
And just one last one. Points in the paint. I think you guys had like 58 tonight.
Mrs. Patricia Williams had spent 42 years shaping young minds, filling her classroom with warmth, wisdom, and the scent of chalk dust and lavender perfume, never realizing that one of her pupils would one day become a global star who would return to repay her quiet heroism. When Caitlin Clark, now a millionaire WNBA player, saw her former teacher standing helpless at a pharmacy counter, unable to afford her life-saving insulin, something deep within her stirred, a mixture of grief, love, and awakening. The woman who had taught her to read and to believe in herself was now calculating whether she could survive another month without medicine. Without hesitation, Caitlin stepped forward, paid for the prescription, and embraced Mrs. Williams, whose frail body trembled as she whispered, "My little Caitlin, is that really you?" That night, in the cold of December, they sat in Caitlin's car as Mrs. Williams shared how a lifetime of teaching had ended in poverty, how her pension barely covered rent, how she had spent her own money on supplies for children who came to school hungry, and how she now faced impossible choices between food and heat. Caitlin wept as she listened, feeling both gratitude and anger at a system that abandoned those who had built its future. Within a week, she had moved Mrs. Williams